Niha kam nikelo hom. Hey oh hey oh hey hey oh hey hey oh 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 wakachata vani wachielo ushemalayo heyo heyo okashela nihakam nikelo heyo. Thank you. Let's have a good talk. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It was beautiful. I'd like to go on with our introduce our panel, and I'm actually going to have our panelists introduce themselves. But I also wanted them, as part of their introduction, is what are some ways when you think about cultural? What are some of the different ways that you think about cultural appropriation in your spaces? And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dusty for introduction and also that thought on what that means.
Okay. Pila mayaye wazi haska na chicheshi John yupia yaloa pila mayaye wana chante mawashte. Dusty Nelson amachiapi wazia haha emataha na oshpashpaye ki ite shitra amataha na Thunder Valley Alwashia Chama. My name is Dusty Nelson. I'm from Pine Ridge. I descend from the Bad Face band of the Lakota people, and I work at Thunder Valley. My title is Lakota Reclamation Coordinator. And I'm really happy to be here and to be part of this discussion and this panel, and I'm looking forward to the meeting. I guess in my space, what I do is I'm a teacher. I was a teacher, an immersion teacher, cultural immersion teacher in a lot of different startup schools, a few different startup schools on a reservation. My experiences in early childhood, the majority of it. And in these spaces, we're really confined to how to figure out how to keep the curriculum authentic, and how do we keep our language and our culture married to each other. In these spaces, what's happening with cultural appropriation is that we're having a lot of people who want to help us, who want to help revitalize our language. And so I think in the bigger picture of it, we're facing outside thought processes and beliefs, people bringing that with them, and then coming into our culture and learning our languages and our way of life, and trying, and meaning well and trying to help us, but and then in turn kind of changing that. So I look at adults who learn to speak Lakota as the bridge between the generations, and so it's a big responsibility. And in those settings, in educational settings, we're just starting to kind of wake up in language and in the way that we look at Western curriculum and how it's impacting our lifeways and our identity.
Thank you, Dusty. Kiliona, the same question, introduction, and then your thoughts on cultural appropriation in your space.
Aloha mai kako, o Kiliona ko inoa, no tonga Aotearoa, te awa te atua a Hawaii au, noho au I wai anai o Kamoku o Hawaii. Aloha everybody, my name is Kiliona. I live in Oahu, Hawaii, on the leeward coast known as Waianae. I am Tongan, Maori, and Hawaiian. I am a educator, cultural educator here in our school systems, kind of transitioning between schools right now, so no need to name them. For me, cultural appropriation in our space wears many hats. There's the obvious of people trying to honor us by wearing our ancestral markings on their skin. As we see, our tattoos have become kind of a fad these days. You see it through hula and in costumes and mascots and such. But more for me as an educator, we're seeing a lot of it through educational platforms as schools make claims of being Hawaiiana or practicing our culture. In all realities, they're just kind of doing a tokenization, which ultimately to me is more of a disgrace than an honor if there's not the mindset behind the action and the understanding of what you're trying to teach and what you're trying to put out there. As we see thousands of teachers come to Hawaii to try to live that, Hawaiian style life. We also see an influx of educational change and a lot of misinterpretations of our culture and our identity and our language. And so today, that's kind of the focus that I'm going to try to talk about, is a lot of that, and how a lot of those Western models have now become the cultural norms in Hawaii of what people think is Hawaiian and Polynesian.
Thank you, nephew. Welcome, Alex.
Hey, my name is Alex Redcorn. I'm a citizen of the Osage Nation. My family's from the Oaxacaline district of the Osage Nation, which is around Pahuska, Oklahoma. I work at Kansas State University in the Department of Educational Leadership, where I'm an assistant professor of ed leadership. First, before I kind of go on, I know I put it in the chat, but yeah, I work at Kansas State, which likes to tout itself as one of the oldest land-grant universities in the United States, and I think it's important to acknowledge that land wasn't just there for the taking, and that came directly from the Kaw people. And so, Kansas State is situated on the Kaw lands, but also it correlates with the establishment of the state of Kansas, which also correlates with the removal of the Osage, my ancestors from the state. And so we're all kind of interconnected in those layers. And I like to use the concept of entanglement, where it's a colonial entanglement that we're in with these types of situations where now I'm working at that university. But if I stick to the introduction, I started as a social studies teacher. And I taught high school social studies, and then I went back and studied educational leadership and became an education academic. And a lot of the work that I've done around the cultural appropriation is advocating for mascot change in the state of Kansas. And we recently had 3 districts in the past few months move on from Native American mascots, and with unanimous school board votes. And so the resistances against those things are kind of different now, but unanimous school board votes in 3 districts changed. But that's typically where I speak from, although it's interconnected with a lot of other things, such as curriculum, what mascots teach us, what mascots teach our children, alongside a curriculum that matches very narrow understanding and teaching. And we can get into that as we get to the panel, but that's generally where I'm speaking from. But I also think answering the larger question is, what is appropriation? And for me, it's I like to frame it in a larger conceptual concept where the history of settler colonialism in the United States is really the ongoing process of dispossessing indigenous peoples from their land, and creating that disconnect between land, both culturally and physically. And it's an extension of that. Cultural appropriation, not just in the form of mascots, but other forms of appropriation, is the extension of that taking, that history of taking, except it's moving from not only land, but also intellectualism and creativity and individuality of who Indigenous peoples are and their intellectual property, in a sense, if you want to frame it that way, even though it's not always necessary to frame things as property like that. But to me, appropriation is an extension, moving from a history of dispossession of land to also identities, and mascots are just one version of that, as it intersects with what we teach kids about Native people in our schools through curriculum and textbook choices and media choices and things like that. And so that's typically where I speak from on the topic of cultural appropriation. And I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel today.
Thank you so much. As a teacher on my home reservation in Pine Ridge, it was about 1992, and I was there was a show on Oprah Winfrey show, and for the first time, they had that I've seen on like a network TV show. They had Native panelists on there. Tim Gallego, who started one of the very first American Indian newspapers that was owned and managed. Susan Harjo, who is a icon, legend, writer, and one of the very first people that actually tried to stop through the court system the appropriation of the Washington Redskins name. And then Michael Haney, who is a leader of the American Indian movement. And I was so excited to watch that panel. And they talked about a young lady that was attending the University of Illinois, Charlene Teeters, who a documentary was made called In Whose Honor. And seeing that documentary and for the first time actually seeing Native people that looked like me, that were from our communities, talking about appropriation and mascots and identity, really was so powerful for me. But it so reinforces the contemporary. You know, you fast forward 30 years later, and as Indigenous people, we still very much struggle with having, you know, voices on TV, being able to see ourselves portrayed in a way that reflects who we are today. You know, professors and teachers and linguists and engineers, all of those different things. Now, when you Google Native Americans, 95% of the information is 150 years ago, like pictures of men wearing war bonnets and older pictures, you know, Edward Curtis type photography. Only 62% of people that live in the United States actually have ever met an American Indian or a Native person. So the lack of information and education is out there, continues to perpetuate, you know, the appropriation and the stealing and the not honoring who we are as Indigenous people. And it's been a subject we've talked about for a long time. Lenora Keesing Tobias back in the 90s talked about "Stop Stealing My Stories." You know, as we were having like a renaissance of Native authors and writers during that time. Now, that leads me to my question, and we'll start off with Dusty. How does cultural appropriation intersect with language and culture curriculum in our schools that serve Native and non-Native students?
Well, so my perspective is always coming from living on the reservation, where the population of students is predominantly Native American. But I also see like so that perspective is like, I think we have a lot of well-meaning people who are our allies and want to help. But when you're coming from your own experiences and those experiences don't match up with an Indigenous perspective, and you're creating things, I think that's a type of appropriation, creating things for Lakota children to use. You know, it's really a question of is it authentic, or is it, being ran through that person's mind? It gets changed somehow. And so that's kind of what my perspective from living on the reservation and working in schools there, but also looking, like you're saying, when we go online, like looking for curriculum, teachers pay teachers, Pinterest, anything. When you do searches on Native Americans, the things that pop up are really, really inaccurate. A lot of times it's the caricatures of people, the Pan Indian, of the Plains Indian with the buffalo hide dress and the feathers and the makeshift teepee, and so there really isn't much out there for people who are wanting to really inform themselves about Indigenous curriculum, Native best practices of Native curriculum. And I think the imagery within those things that are being taught in schools where the population of Native Americans isn't as high on the reservation is also perpetuating the idea that we're still somehow in the historical past in mainstream America's eyes. And it's a difficult question. I'm sure you guys can talk more to that.
I can chime in too. So I agree. One of the biggest issues we have is that there was a study 2015 that found that 87%, as Dusty was talking about, found 87% of all social studies standards in the United States are framed in a pre-1900 context. So by design, what the entire country is supposed to learn about Native Americans as per state standards is a stuck in the past narrow stereotype that Indians are only in the past, really. And what happens is when that collides with mascots, and when I talk about mascots, I usually call it the mascot curriculum. When we brand our schools and institutions around American Indian people and those same stereotypes, we are teaching our students, we're reinforcing what they're learning in the curriculum by design. And the issue is so systemic that those same issues are found in the textbook choices that schools have when they choose their books. They're found in the early childhood literature choices when they choose what to put in front of them. They're also found in the media options that they have when a social studies teacher is going to put on a movie or something. And so the mascot curriculum, or American Indian mascots, what we learned through that is that same stereotype, and it's perpetually reinforced over and over and over at every turn within our institutions. And so when we talk about wanting to end American Indian mascots, that's just one piece of what needs to happen, because what also needs to happen is we need to have a complete overhaul of many of our curricula as well. That also depends on what state and community you're in, because there's a wide variety of progress on those fronts depending on where you're at. In Kansas, I'll just be specific. I can do a keyword search in our state social studies curriculum, and the word Osage is nowhere, even though we occupied a big portion of the state for a long period of time. And the word Kansas is everywhere because it's the Kansas State Social Studies curriculum, but the Kaw people and the Kanza people, that word shows up once in the entire 200-page document of the social studies standards. And so that's the invisibility that we're talking about. While mascots kind of parade this idea of honoring, there needs to be a substantive challenge to our curricular standards as well.
DeLeona, do you have some thoughts on this?
I mean, everything they said was really, really well said. For me, on this matter, just the representation across the board has been a very Eurocentric vision of Indigenous people and Native Americans, and this goes all the way back to things like Disney movies, Disney shows, television that just only portrays a particular type of Indian or Native American, and it's always a one-sided lens. And it's kind of this ideology that indigenous people are spiritual people, one with land. And in the negative lens, it's always alcoholics, bad guys, thieves, and over generations, it's just becoming internalized to certain demographics and certain people, and so even native people ourselves are starting to see ourselves in academia as a not possible dream. Myself with such little Pacific Island people in higher education and role models, I just never thought that was such a obtainable thing, and it took a lot of seeing specifically Tongan scholars make their way to PhD levels for me to finally realize that we too can obtain these higher education levels. But I think that the deterrent and the lack of Indigenous people is a huge issue within higher education too, and I think that it deters a lot of students to not even acquire higher education in the first place, and those that do seem to tiptoe in the shadows. And God forbid you're one of those Indigenous people in an Ivy League school, because then you're tokenized and you're tiptoeing even more because it seems like so many more eyes are on you in those spaces. So I can stop there before I just ramble, but that's just kind of the things I was thinking of as I heard them talking.
Another idea that's kind of running a thread through here is the idea of representation, and that's a huge issue. And both of them hit on it just now. And it's one of those things when Dusty's talking about, you have people that want to do things a good way, a right way, and they want to help. But what happens when you have people start creating materials about Native people, that there's a risk there of appropriation. And so one of the perspectives that I often like to push is we need to build the capacities of tribal education departments. So I come from a strong lens of looking at education through TEDs or TEAs, tribal education agencies or tribal education departments. And if we can build their capacities and help TEDs have the right people and the resources to actually be more involved in the construction of curricula and the construction of materials, that really can help solve a lot of problems, because knowing that we're not necessarily going to have every Native student interacting with 100% Native teachers everywhere they go, you have a lot of non-Native folks who could then go to specific tribes and say, hey, how should I be approaching this lesson, or do you have any resources? And tribes could have if they build their capacities to do those things, you minimize that risk of helping the wrong way, because then you can go straight to the source, those people and their sovereignty and their intellectual sovereignty, not just their political sovereignty. But also along those lines, on a mascot point of view, you most often have a whole bunch of non-natives making decisions about how to represent Native people on school boards. So when a school board makes a decision to keep a mascot or to approve a curriculum or something like that, typically, even if a school has 40-50% Native students, there is most often not a 40 or 50% representation on that school board of Native peoples. And so that's also an issue of representation. And like he said, I could just keep going on, so I better stop and let somebody else speak.
No, I think those are really important points. And I think that, one of the issues with appropriation is in terms of like even intellectual property of our language, our stories, when you have organizations or even corporations come in and they, either not intended well or with well intentions, they want to come in and they want to do a story or they want to do a film, but they lack the consultation of Native people in any of the decision making. And so that property becomes disputed because those stories and those images go back to our relatives and our communities, and they should stay within those communities and not profit. People shouldn't profit off of that culture or those stories or that imagery because those profits never come back into our community. And so those images are just, they become lost. And I think that's a huge, those are some huge issues. What are some different examples of within the education field, within organizations that for well-intentioned come in, but then often do more damage than they do good?
I'll go first. So there's something happening within Ocheti Shakawi and our elders. And so there, as you may all know, there's been a huge language gap created from the boarding school era in our language transmission. And so the fluent speakers, the native speakers are of a certain age, which is older. They're elderly now. And so there could quite be a pause in our existence as a tribe where we no longer have native first language speakers because we're not creating them as fast as they're passing away. And so it got really, really scary during COVID times. And that drew attention to, so I work in immersion. The best way to learn is from a fluent speaker. Okay, we need access to fluent speakers, to native speakers. And you know, the next best thing to having an actual person there is the recordings, those stories. And so there was a group I believe in the early 90s who came in and recorded large amounts of our elders and got their family histories, talked to them about words. And there's this huge database of stories of people, very influential elders in our community that exist somewhere that nobody has access to. And so that's a problem right there because we're struggling to create first language speakers, but there's this group that has, you know, people like Johnson Holy Rock, people like Philomene Lakota, people in our tribe that were very cherished and knowledgeable, recordings of these people that we don't have access to. And so that creates another barrier on top of the work that we're doing is, well, how do we get those back? And how do we, you know, begin the conversation of reclaiming those stories? Because they're not just stories, they're not just words for the dictionary, they're not just things to put on a database. Those are parts of our living culture, parts of our identity, and it's beyond, you know, it concerns data sovereignty, spiritual sovereignty, and the survival of our way of life. And I can go on and on about this too, but I'm just gonna say that's the situation we're in right now. And you know, it's gonna be a big task for us to reclaim those things, but also repair the community because it has created a divide between the people who support this organization and the people who are saying, but what they're doing is harmful. And how can we approach them when there's a huge divide? You know, how do we get from calling out to calling in? Because ultimately everybody wants the same thing, but that's my piece.
And I might not be answering the original question, but piggybacking off some of what was said just now, in the Osage community, we actually, none of our best speakers typically won't claim first language status. So some of our best speakers are second language speakers and grew up in an atmosphere where they heard it and experienced the language way more than other people in the community. And so we're leaning on them a lot and almost unfairly too much because they inherited that burden in a way. It's also a gift, but it takes a lot of work to do. You can't just throw money at that situation. But one of the things that's resonating with me and what Dusty was just saying is that too often we think of Native culture, if we want to incorporate Native culture in schools, we think about it in terms of just putting it into a scope and sequence curriculum. And we think, okay, we need to learn about this thing or that thing, and what we forget is that the curriculum should resonate more deeply with the cultural components behind it. And so we need to not just think about embedding Native culture into our curricula. We also need to think about how it's infused into our work environment and the school environment and the everyday ins and outs of interactions going on in that school. So from a leadership perspective in schools, we often talk about creating a positive work culture. So what does your work culture look like? Is it centered on student needs and student success? And so for me, embedding these things into the culture and going to that deeper level, we need to think about the everyday interactions that occur in that school environment, and are they aligned with that local place-based understanding of what it means to be Indigenous, Native to those local communities? Are the everyday relationship building interactions in line with those things, or are we only looking at culture to be moved into standards and learning objectives? Because I think both are needed in a way, but the relationship building and the work culture and the student culture, that's actually maybe even more important than what's in the standards. So anyway.
Yeah, this topic had a lot for me. So to begin with, just the idea of other organizations benefiting off of our stories and our ancestry. You know, for a lot of us Pacific Islanders, that was a big deal in the 2015, 2016 era, as Disney was ramping up to put out the movie Moana. I myself felt very mixed about it. I will be honest, I cried as I watched it, just being to see our people on such a global stage was something I never thought would happen in my life. But at the same time, I was incredibly skeptical, being the 56th grandson of Maui, Akalana, the Maui that you saw in Moana. It's a family affair to us. That is my ancestor. I am a descendant of Maui, and many of us are. And so that was kind of the sticky note there, even though they did reach out to a multitude of scholars and Pacific um, community leaders and cultural advocates. It was still in some aspects inconsistent with our identities, and there are the issues of it, regardless how much I want to enjoy it. But on the aspect of education and things that are faulting within it, to back what I've heard from other people, when it comes to appropriation in our academia here, to go off Alex, we need more implementation of our cultures in the classroom and throughout the entire K through 12 experience, but also within our institutions. This could, fall back on the idea of Bray Boy's Story of the Bean, where he talks about how vital it is of Indigenous students becoming Indigenous educators and teaching from their Indigenous lens. As one of their student teachers discusses how she took a science project and then incorporated it around her ancestors and her people's methodologies and legends around planting seasonal beans and such, and why you plant certain things with other things and how they coexist and actually replenish the soil rather than deteriorate it. It's those kind of things that I struggle with creating a curriculum that embodies all of Hawaii, because no matter how much you put into it, somebody's always going to teach it a different way, and somebody will always belittle or not understand where those legends and those stories, how intricate and how deep those are to a people. If someone comes from outside and tries to teach that same thing, they might teach it as a belittled story of, oh, and then Santa Claus came down the chimney and blah blah blah, and he's a magical being. But to us, these aren't magical beings. These are our people. These are our ancestors. These are our forms of existence and resistance. And to have somebody come in and teach those curriculums that are the textbook state standard, even when we do it right on our side, somebody coming in will always misappropriate it, misinterpret it, because it's bound to happen. It's not their story. It's not their history. They're not invested in it. They have no desire to really embody that the way it should be. And why should they, for that matter? And that, I think that's a really hard part that I battle with creating curriculum in Hawaii and the greater Oceania. I can stop there. I got a lot more to say, but I'll let it pass.
Well, there's two things that resonate with me, what was just shared. So the movie brought up something that's happening right now in the Osage community, Killers of the Flower Moon. It's about the Osage oil murders. My great-grandfather is mentioned in that book, Killers of the Flower Moon, and now it's being made into a movie with Martin Scorsese, Robert De Niro, Leonardo DiCaprio, all the big names. And there's a lot of excitement around there, and there's a heck of a lot of fear with what in the heck are they going to do with us? And how are we going to be portrayed? And there's a lot of important nuance that has to go into that. So there's a lot of fear, and I don't know what I'm going to experience the first time I see it. And so it reminded me of that. And also the second point that kind of came up is we really, and resonates with Teach for America, this is really calling on, we need teachers to have a higher degree of efficacy in how to handle making Indigenous peoples visible, because we need more Natives in the classrooms to help reduce that. But we also as teachers, but we also know that we're relying heavily on non-Native teachers. And so our teacher training programs need to really address that. And that it starts with conversations like this, but being able to find those resources, know where to go, how to process that problem solving is a really important part of this process, because Natives are usually kind of invisible in teacher training programs.
Yeah, I think one thing that's so important for folks to know too is, we never were called Native American or American Indians. We're, sovereign members of citizens of tribal nations, over 570. And so it's a daunting responsibility to be like on a national team and be the voice of like the Native Alliance when there's so many different tribes. So I try to let people know to do your research in your community, because every region across Teach for America is on Indigenous lands. And there's Indigenous people that are here, that are experts, or that can come in and speak to the teachers, or could help with different understandings of, like even with consultation, if you're looking to work with vendors or speakers or whatever, or artists, that you can work directly with that community rather than looking at a broader scale. And, I would never be so arrogant to think, myself being from Pine Ridge, that I'm an expert on the Navajo Nation, and I could never go down there and speak on behalf of their tribe or any of their communities. It's so diverse. Dusty, I really liked your how you articulated about the cultural appropriation in education, and you mentioned a word that's really kind of a buzzword around, and that's reclaiming. We're seeing with different organizations in the land back issue, reclaiming Indigenous land, getting our land back in the hands of our Indigenous people. How do we like reclaim the harm of cultural appropriation within our education systems? What are some different like strategic things that we could do in terms of that? Alex or Dusty?
Yeah, I can only speak from my perspective and my viewpoint and my experience. And so some of the things that we're doing within Thunder Valley and in some partner schools that we have in our network is really, and I think that Alex talked about this, is reestablishing a connection with the land, and how does that look? And so for Lakota people, that is the spiritual calendar, which is based on the seasons. And so using, that model of our traditional life ways, the things that the ceremonies and the activities that fall within that season, that's the foundation. And so then we take, contemporary ways that, because we're highly adaptable, our best as Indigenous people, our best characteristic is adaptability. So taking our ways as the foundation, not something that's plugged in here and there, but as the foundation, that thought, that philosophy, and then using tools and adapting it. And so what we're doing here at Thunder Valley is following the spiritual calendar, bringing awareness to those ceremonies at certain times of the year, including our allies and our non-native friends, and letting them be a part of that so that they understand the rhythms of our way of life. But then we're also using Montessori, and so we're taking our lifeways into the children's house and adapting Montessori to fit our time, place, and culture right now. But I think for the larger picture, just being aware, of the indigenous people that you're working with, and their practices and their philosophies and the rhythms in which they lived, and helping them to reconnect to the land and ceremony. Even if you can't be a part of that, I know that in some places that's not possible, but in other places, like here, we're starting to, really try to be open to people who work with our children, and people who come in to help us. We ask them to help us help ourselves. And people bring their own skill set, their own expertise, and if we can, help us reclaim, reestablish a connection, reclaim and renew the way we look at educating ourselves, not how we're being educated, but the way that we educate ourselves.
Yeah, I'm going to jump on the adaptability bandwagon here, because that's such an important point, especially when we start out thinking about things like mascots and stereotypes, as this stuck in the past stereotypes. You'll hear Osage elders talk often about how we move forward. We're very forward-thinking people, and how do we move forward and adapt? And one of my favorite paragraphs that I ever read was Osage anthropologists talking about how the Osage, how we could use Osage ribbon work as a way to think about our colonial entanglements. And one of the things, it was Jean Dennison, and she, in this book about us reforming our government, she laid out this metaphor for, we took these, we went and we traded with the French for these fancy European ribbons. And through that trade, we took them, but then we paid for them, and then we reformed them, reworked them to represent us in the way we see and view the world. And they represent our creativity and our ongoing adaptation, even though we're inheriting some different types of products and things. I often think about that in terms of school systems. So how can we take these entanglements that we inherited, the fact that over 90% of our students are actually attending public schools, not BIE schools or tribally run schools. Over 90% of our students are attending public schools. So we inherited these systems. How can we think about reworking those systems to work for our people instead? But yeah, so I just want to reemphasize what Dusty's talking about, adaptability. I just think that's super important to take away from when we think about Native people in our educational systems, period.
And I kind of talk about it with people that I work with as creating a reclamation culture. So, we have to take our lifeways and our traditions and figure out how to reconnect, but also how does it fit our contemporary modern lives?
I think one of the important things to do, I'm going to circle back to empowering tribal education departments. In order to enhance or reduce appropriation, you have to enhance and amplify the voices of those communities. And so through building capacities in tribal education departments, that's through partnership building, whether you sign MOAs, intergovernmental agreements with them, you collaborate with them to build curriculum, you collaborate with them for X, Y, and Z. But anything we do to build our partnerships and build the capacities of tribal education departments, I think reduces the likelihood of encountering issues of appropriation.
I mean, all good points. For us over here in Hawaii, I think for us, it's a lot of teaching things from the correct standpoint of understanding. So if you're going to teach a chant or a melee or a prayer, doing it from the right capacity and understanding exactly what you're telling your kids they need to say and what the meaning of it is. For instance, a lot of schools here do a chant in the morning called Ehomai, but they never teach the history of Ehomai and how it even came to be. And for us, it's a song of reclaiming our identities that were lost through years of religious assimilation and American assimilation. And so we created it in the 70s to kind of be like, hey, we need help from above. Give us that knowledge, just let it soak in. But we don't teach that history to the kids. We just tell them to sing this song and they don't understand the meanings behind it. So for me, it's kind of going back to the foundations of reteaching our foundational skills of what it is to be an Indigenous person. How do we start those lessons early on to make sure that the mindset is there and that every aspect of the way it stays there? The teachers that come and go will learn these things in PD trainings and such. That way they're continuing this knowledge to the kids. It's also creating PD trainings for educators that are rooted in from our people in our communities. Like Alex was saying too, they need to be grounded in with our communities. And for you guys in the States, that's going to vary town to town, being that so many tribes are sometimes located right next to each other. We need to have cultural educators from those places that are helping us create these curriculums for our educators and for our kids. That way we are doing it from the lens of that community. People in Waianae are going to differ from people on the other side of the island or people from other islands here in Hawaii even. And so that's kind of where things can get hard and where things can get tricky. I think it's going to be dependent on schools individually working within their communities rather than at a state level for a lot of us Indigenous groups.
Thank you all for this incredible discussion. And like I said, we're going to definitely continue on with a series of different discussions on cultural appropriation. But as we close out, I'd like to, if you could, maybe leave some contact information or how folks could learn more about your program. Dusty, you're at Thunder Valley. Can you close out with how they can learn more or find out more?
Yes, so I work for Thunder Valley, and you can check us out at thundervalley.org. The initiative that I work in is the Lakota Language Initiative, and there is a tab on the website for that.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, I put my email in the chat box. Feel free to email me if anybody's got any questions. That includes resources, research on cultural appropriation, particularly mascots. I'll post a link for the Kansas Association for Native American Education. We've posted some stuff publicly to try to help with public education on some things. But yeah, anybody feel free to reach out anytime.
Being that I'm transitioning between schools, I don't have an official work email right now, so I put my personal in there. But I'm just a cultural practitioner, educator here in Hawaii, and apprentice to become a kumuhula and Hawaiian priest. So anybody who need help with any of that, I'm also a grad student for Indigenous education right now at ASU. So if anybody needs curriculum on Hawaii stuff, wants to talk story about policy of education and ways that you can implement Indigenous methodologies into your classroom in the plethora of classes, be it math, science, English, please reach out and I will do my best to assist you on creating more culturally appropriate lessons.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a wonderful weekend. Remember our relatives who are passed on during this Memorial Day. And thank you so much. Much love. Be safe, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.